When Maya moved to the small town, she thought she was just chasing a dream of peace and opportunity. But instead, she walked into a place where whispers turned to insults, insults turned to attacks, and hate tried to crush her spirit. What no one knew was that this quiet girl carried more strength than an entire town's prejudice. Because when they tried to break her, she fought back with power and grace that no one could forget. Maya stepped off the bus with her suitcase gripped tightly in her hand, her heart beating with the rhythm of both hope and fear. The small town of Ashford stretched before her with its clean streets, white picket fences, and people who seemed to already know one another's names, faces, and secrets. At first glance, it looked peaceful, almost perfect, like a postcard picture that promised quiet afternoons and slow sunsets. But as Maya dragged her suitcase along the cracked sidewalk toward her new rented cottage at the edge of town, she felt the stairs settle on her like invisible weights. Women paused in their gardening. Men stopped mid-conversation at the gas station, and children gawked from bicycles, their eyes wide as though they had never seen someone like her before. She tried to smile, offering polite nods, but most turned away, whispering behind cupped hands. By the time she reached the tiny white cottage with peeling paint and an overgrown yard, she already knew this town was not going to make space for her easily. That night, as she unpacked her clothes and set her books on a rickety shelf, she sat by the window and watched the town lights flicker in the distance, reminding herself of why she came here in the first place. For a fresh start, for an education, for a chance to carve out her own path away from the noise of the city. But deep inside, a knot of unease sat heavy in her stomach. The first day of school only confirmed her fears. Walking into the classroom, every conversation hushed, and all eyes turned toward her. The teacher introduced her with the faintest smile, and then continued as if she wasn't there. Maya chose a seat near the window, but it became clear she was sitting alone not by choice, but by the silent rules of the class. When she raised her hand to answer a question, the teacher's gaze slipped past her as if her presence was air. When she handed in her homework, it came back ungraded. At lunch, when she carried her tray to a table, the students slid closer together, closing off any space. Their laughter rang in her ears as she quietly sat at an empty corner table, forcing herself to eat without letting her hands tremble. Days blurred into a pattern of isolation, whispers in the hallway, muffled giggles when she walked past, and the sting of being invisible when she longed for even the smallest acknowledgement. Still, Maya kept her head high, carrying the weight of dignity that her mother always told her was her crown. At the library, she buried herself in books, telling herself that knowledge could not be taken away. At night, she wrote in her journal, pouring out the loneliness and the small victories, like the smile from the old shopkeeper who had slipped an extra piece of candy into her bag, or the little girl who waved shyly before her mother pulled her away. Yet, as each day passed, the pressure of being different pressed harder. The town had built its walls not of stone, but of silence, and Maya felt them tightening around her. She wanted to believe she could break through, that she could prove her worth. But the question lingered. How long could she stand against a tide that seemed determined to push her back? On the last night of her first week, as she stood outside her cottage watching the stars, she whispered to herself, "They don't know me yet." Her voice trembled, but inside her, a small fire sparked. She didn't realize it then, but this was the beginning of a battle that would test not just her strength, but her very spirit. The second week in Ashford began like a cruel repetition of the first, only sharper, colder, and heavier with malice. As if the entire town had silently agreed that Maya's presence was a disruption they were unwilling to tolerate. The stares turned to smirks, the whispers to open laughter, and the passive silence to deliberate acts meant to chip away at her spirit piece by piece. At school, the hostility grew louder. Books were knocked from her desk with a sly push, her chair mysteriously pulled away just as she was about to sit, and her name twisted into ugly jokes that echoed across the hallway. The teacher, who should have been her shield, remained indifferent, his eyes sliding away each time she looked to him for even a sliver of fairness, which hurt more than the jeers themselves, because it told her the rules of this place. No one would step in. She was on her own. At lunch, a carton of milk accidentally spilled across her tray, soaking her food and dripping onto her lap, the culprits grinning as the cafeteria roared with laughter. Maya swallowed her pride, stood up slowly, wiped herself down, and walked out with her head high, though inside she burned with humiliation so fierce it felt like fire crawling under her skin. On the way home, the cruelty didn't stop. An egg splattered against her jacket from a passing car, laughter trailing behind as she froze on the sidewalk, clutching her books tighter. Her breath caught between rage and tears she refused to shed. Even the adults in town were no kinder. At the grocery store, the cashier let her stand at the counter ignored, while others were served ahead of her. At the park, mothers pulled their children closer, eyes filled with suspicion, as if her very existence was a threat. It was a suffocating wall of rejection, designed not with fists or chains, but with silence, mockery, and dismissal. Each act a small blade cutting at her resolve. That night, she sat on her narrow bed, staring at her hands, trembling from the weight of it all, asking herself why she had come here, why she thought she could belong in a place that clearly didn't want her. For a brief moment, despair pressed down so hard she wanted to disappear, to pack her suitcase and leave in the dark without looking back. But then, her mother's words floated up in her memory, words she had heard since childhood. Dignity is your armor, Maya. Never let them strip it away. She closed her eyes, breathed deep, and repeated those words like a prayer, feeling the tiniest flicker of strength return. The next day, when the same boys tried to shove her books to the ground, she caught them midair, her steady eyes locking on theirs until they faltered, unused to resistance. When the cafeteria filled with laughter again, she calmly picked up her food, moved to her corner, and ate with deliberate grace, her posture unbroken, her silence louder than their noise. The cruelty did not stop. In fact, It sharpened with every ounce of strength she showed, but something in her had shifted. She realized that every time they tried to break her, she had a choice: to bend or to stand. And though her heart ached and her nights were still filled with loneliness, she began to choose standing. The townspeople did not yet know it, but in their attempt to crush her, they were forging something stronger inside her, a will that would not bow. One evening, after another long day of being mocked, she walked past a store window and caught her reflection. Instead of seeing a defeated girl, she saw a young woman with her chin lifted, her eyes steady, her back straight. And in that moment, she whispered to her reflection, "You are more than their hate." It was not loud. No one else heard it, but it was the beginning of a vow that she would not let this town write her story for her. By the third week, something inside Maya shifted, not in a loud explosion, but like a quiet ember that suddenly caught fire, because she realized that every insult, every shove, every cruel laugh wasn't just about her. It was about a town that feared anyone who dared to be different. And if she allowed herself to break, she would be confirming the very lie they wanted to believe, that she was less. So when she walked into school that Monday morning, her shoulders squared, her steps unhurried, and her gaze steady, the hall seemed to pause, the bullies whispering to each other, confused that their torment hadn't hollowed her out. In English class, when the teacher ignored her raised hand as usual, Maya spoke anyway, her voice clear and confident, answering the question with such sharp insight that even the students who mocked her fell silent, because her brilliance could not be denied. The teacher's lips tightened, his discomfort obvious, but Maya's heart swelled with quiet triumph, knowing she had carved her presence into a space that tried to erase her. That afternoon, when a group of girls tried to corner her in the restroom, sneering at her hair and calling her names meant to sting, Maya stood tall, her eyes unflinching as she told them, "Your words say more about you than they ever will about me," before walking out, leaving them speechless, their laughter dying in their throats. The strength she carried was not born of anger, but of grace, and it unsettled them more than if she had shouted or fought back with fists. Outside of school, she found small pockets of humanity too, an elderly librarian who noticed her love for books and quietly slipped her extra reading material, whispering, "Keep feeding that mind of yours, child," and a janitor who offered a kind nod each morning. Gestures so small, yet so powerful, because they reminded her that not everyone in Ashford was poisoned by hate. Slowly, Maya began to build her own rhythm, her own quiet rebellion. She poured her energy into her studies, into journaling late at night, writing lines that spoke of strength, justice, and the dream of a life where she wouldn't have to fight just to exist. And though no one else saw those pages, they became her secret shield. The town tried new tricks. Someone scrawled slurs across her locker. Another time, a rock was thrown through the window of her house late at night. But instead of crumbling, she collected those moments like evidence, each one proof of the ugliness she was determined not to let define her. And then came the day of the debate competition, an event Maya had hesitated to join, but ultimately chose as her battleground. Because if the town wanted her silent, then speaking with power was her greatest act of defiance. When she stood on that stage, the room buzzing with curiosity and disdain, Maya spoke with clarity, weaving arguments sharp as glass and laced with truth, her words not just persuasive, but piercing, carrying the weight of her dignity and the fire of her determination. By the time she finished, the auditorium was silent, the judges stunned, the students staring in reluctant respect, and though some still refused to clap, enough did that Maya knew she had made her mark. Walking home that night, the cool wind brushing her face, Maya realized she was no longer just surviving Ashford. She was challenging it, showing them that she could not be erased, that she carried within her both power and grace. And in that realization, she felt the ember inside her flare into a flame that would only grow stronger. The weeks rolled into months, and Maya's presence in Ashford was no longer just a quiet resistance, but a storm that people could no longer ignore. Because, while some still clung to their cruelty, others began to notice that every time she was pushed down, she rose taller, and every time she was silenced, she found a louder way to speak. It started when a younger boy in school, shy and often picked on for being poor, was cornered by the same bullies who used to target her. And without hesitation, Maya stepped between them, her voice cutting like steel as she told them to back off. The sight of her unwavering stance making even the most vicious among them falter, because she was no longer the new girl. They knew by now she would not break, and that truth weakened their grip on fear. Word of that moment spread quickly, and soon other students, who had been too afraid to speak, began sitting near her at lunch, whispering their own stories of being mistreated, their voices tentative but growing stronger in her presence. And Maya listened to each one, giving them space to feel seen in a town that thrived on making people invisible. Her journals became fuller, not just with her pain, but with the stories of others. And she realized she was no longer carrying just her fight, she was carrying theirs too, weaving together a tapestry of resilience that could not be burned or erased. At home, her mother noticed the shift, saw how her daughter's eyes now held both fire and tenderness. And though she worried for her safety, she told Maya, "Grace is not weakness. It's the sharpest weapon you have, use it, but never let it harden your heart." Those words echoed in her mind when the school announced a community assembly, meant to celebrate unity. But Maya suspected, crafted as a performance to silence criticism from outsiders who had begun hearing whispers of Ashford's treatment of its newcomers. When the principal asked for student speakers, no one expected Maya to volunteer. Yet there she was, standing at the podium in front of the entire town, her hands steady on the wood, her eyes scanning a sea of faces filled with curiosity, skepticism, and in some corners, quiet hope. She began slowly, speaking of her move to Ashford, of how she had tried to blend in, to belong, but was met with walls instead of doors, cruelty instead of welcome. Her words were plain, easy to understand, but each carried the weight of truth that no one could deny. And as she spoke, the silence in the room grew heavier, not out of boredom, but out of confrontation, as people were forced to see themselves through her story. Then she lifted her chin and said, "But I am still here. I am still learning, still growing, still rising, and I will not be broken because my dignity is not yours to take." The words cracked the room wide open. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others lowered their heads in shame, but many clapped, tentatively at first, then with force, until the applause echoed across the gymnasium like thunder. For the first time, Maya felt the tide shift, not completely, but enough to show that power and grace, when carried with unwavering strength, could pierce even the thickest walls of prejudice. Walking off the stage, she knew not everyone in that crowd would change, but enough had heard her, enough had seen her, and enough had been given courage to speak their own truths. That night, in the quiet of her room, Maya wrote in her journal, "They tried to break me, but instead they taught me how strong I am. And now, I will make sure no one else has to stand alone." Her flame had become a beacon, and though Ashford remained a place of shadows, it could no longer deny the light she carried. The morning after her speech, Ashford felt different, not entirely changed, but as though something had cracked open, a door that could no longer be shut. And Maya could feel it in the way people looked at her in the hallways, not with pity or cruelty, but with a new kind of awareness, a recognition that she had carved her place in this town with her own hands. Yet she also knew the fight wasn't over, because power doesn't yield easily, and those who had built their identity on breaking others would not go quietly. A week later, the bullies tried one last time, cornering her near the old oak tree where it had all begun, their words sharp, their intent clear. But when Maya stood tall, others stood with her, the boy she had defended, the girls who once whispered their fears to her, even a few who had been silent until now. One by one, they stepped forward, surrounding her in a circle of unity. And for the first time, the bullies looked outnumbered, their smirks fading as the strength of many overpowered the cruelty of a few. Maya didn't need to shout or fight. She simply looked them in the eyes and said, "You don't get to define me. You don't get to define any of us." Her voice rang with finality, and in that moment, the balance shifted forever. The bullies turned away, stripped of the fear they once thrived on. Their power dissolved in the face of courage that refused to break. Word of the standoff spread like wildfire, echoing through every corner of Ashford, and suddenly Maya was no longer just the new black girl. She was the girl who stood tall when everyone else bent, the girl who fought back not with fists, but with unshakable grace. Teachers began calling on her opinion in class. Neighbors who once avoided her mother now offered quiet smiles. And even those who had mocked her found themselves questioning their own silence. But Maya didn't bask in the attention. Instead, she turned it into action, forming a small group at school where students could share their struggles openly. A safe space born from her determination to ensure no one else would suffer alone. Slowly, Ashford's walls began to crack, letting light in where there had only been shadows. And though not everyone changed, enough did for hope to grow roots. One evening, as the sun set over the town, Maya sat by her window, writing in her journal, the same journal that had once held her tears and loneliness now brimmed with strength, and the voices of many, and she wrote, "They tried to break me, but I became the proof that grace is stronger than hate. This town may not fully love me, but it will never forget me." She closed the book with a soft smile, knowing her story wasn't over, because this was not just her victory. It was the beginning of many others finding their courage too. And as she drifted to sleep, the words of her mother echoed in her heart. Grace is not weakness. It is power unshaken. Maya had learned to fight back with both, and in doing so, she left behind a light that Ashford could never again dim. Power like this can't be silenced. Stay with Blax Stories for the next fight that will leave you breathless.